The Wall by Pink Floyd is one of the most well-known concept records and possibly the greatest rock opera ever recorded. It spoke to a generation and continues to resonate with listeners today. For many, it's their favorite Floyd album, but it's one that came at the terrible cost of tearing the band apart. On today's program, we are featuring what it took to build The Wall. With the releases of The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals, Pink Floyd cemented themselves as one of the biggest bands in the world, commanding sold-out live tours all around the world. From special effect lighting, state-of-the-art speaker systems, pyrotechnics, and projections, their live shows in the early to mid-70s were like nothing any other band were doing. While they preferred to play smaller venues of 20,000 seats or less, the amount of power their shows required meant that only sports arenas and stadiums could handle the scale. But because of the sheer size of these venues, it took much longer to fill them, and that meant a lot of the audience was there hours before the show started. Also, Pink Floyd rarely employed an opening act, so many of the concertgoers got bored waiting for the band, and this would inevitably lead to drinking, smoking, and other drug use. Often by the time the band came on, a good portion of the audience were pretty loaded or even passed out. And with each tour getting bigger and bigger, Pink Floyd became increasingly aware that they were losing the communal experience that they enjoyed in smaller venues. It was near impossible for them to connect to the crowd beyond the first 30 rows. On top of this, bassist Roger Waters was growing frustrated at the trade-off of having a stadium full of fans diluted the message of their music and gave the impression that the whole show was just about the money. This came to a head on the evening of July 6, 1977. It was their final show of the In the Flesh tour, and things did not go well. From the start, Roger was annoyed with the crowd.
Oh, for fuck's sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming. I'm trying to sing a song.
His anger culminated with him spitting on a fan. Apparently, the concertgoer was a part of a group close to the stage that kept shouting at the band the whole concert, and this was starting to get on Roger's nerves. In his mind, this rowdy group of fans represented the views of the entire stadium. He wanted them to be quiet and just experience the music. According to drummer Nick Mason, Roger's actions were way out of character. Normally, he was the one to quell hecklers or kill time during technical difficulties, but he wasn't the only one feeling off that night. When it came time to play their final encore, guitarist David Gilmour didn't return to the stage. Instead, he made his way through the crowd to the back of the house and watched the performance from the mixing board. In that moment, he felt Pink Floyd achieved all they wanted as a band, and he wasn't sure what was left. To make matters worse, he was feeling increasingly depressed during the show because to him, they were ending a 6-month tour with a bad performance and he couldn't stand to finish it. In his stead, Snowy White played guitar. The experience was profound and life-changing for Roger. He left the concert wanting to literally construct a wall to separate himself from the audience. From this feeling, inspiration came to him in droves, and by July of 1978, he recorded 2 demos for 2 complete albums. An early version of The Wall titled Bricks in the Wall, and its follow-up, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. After the band heard both, it was a unanimous decision to move forward with The Wall and to leave the Hitchhiking demo for Roger to release on his own, which he did in 1984. It came as a relief to the band to hear his concept so well formed this early in the process, because for their previous albums, they would often take a long time getting ideas together. But the completeness of the demo made it difficult for the rest of the band to hear where they fit in. Not only that, Roger made it clear from the very beginning that this was his project and the rest of the band will get to play on it. He literally told David that he can help produce, but Nick and Richard would not be invited as producers. Keyboardist Richard Wright insisted he'd be allowed to co-produce, for he feared that without his input, the album would lose the magic of everyone working together. Roger agreed, but only to a trial basis, since in his mind, Richard hadn't really done much producing on their previous albums, despite receiving credit for it. So why did the rest of the band agree to Roger's demands? Well, Basically, no one else had a better idea. Both David Gilmour and Richard Wright spent the early part of 1978 putting most of their creative energies into their own solo albums. From the very beginning, Roger conceived The Wall as an album, a live show, and a film. It was to be a multimedia experience unlike the world had ever seen. But because of the massive scale of the project, Roger brought on Bob Ezrin to help produce and coordinate. He previously produced albums for Lou Reed, Peter Gabriel, and Alice Cooper. One of his first contributions was to write a nearly 40-page script to flesh out the story of The Wall, which was incredibly helpful during recording. Bob was also key in convincing Roger to make the story more universal and less autobiographical, as he foresaw that the audience probably didn't want to hear about the complaints of a rich rock star. Formal recording began at the Britannia Rose studio in the fall of 1978 with James Guthrie as recording engineer and co-producer. Around the same time, Roger brought on artist and animator Gerald Scarfe. It was rather unusual to collaborate with an artist this early in the process, but their relationship proved fruitful. His concept art inspired Roger's lyrics, and in turn, as the songs developed, they informed Gerald's work. The pieces he created became vital to the album artwork, as well as the animations and puppets used for the tour and the 1982 film. Incidentally, the cover art for The Wall marks the first time since Pink Floyd's debut to not feature artwork designed by Hipgnosis. Gerald intended the inside art to be the cover, but Roger opted for the more minimalist cover we see today. By March of 1979, they had a new demo of the album, but they were about to be hit with a host of financial troubles. In 1976, the band hired the financial firm of Norton Warburg to help funnel their pre-tax album royalties into venture capitalist investments. These ranged from skateboards to pizza parlors, hotels, and even an early video game console. These investments protected the band from paying up to 83% tax on their earnings. However, in 1978, the band's financial advisor discovered that those in charge of the firm were taking money from the investment side to offset the failing venture capital side. Essentially, the executives were falsifying profits to hide the fact they were actually losing money. The company folded soon after, leaving the band with a £3 million loss and owing the Crown anywhere from £5 to £12 million in back taxes. It became quite clear that they needed to make a lot of money quickly. Since The Wall was still far from complete, they were advised to leave the country for at least a year and make as much money as possible. This would not only allow them to legally avoid paying taxes on those earnings, but more importantly, it would give them the time they needed to finish The Wall. It was do or die for the band. They relocated to Super Bear Studios in the mountains above Nice, France, a choice made easier by the fact that both David and Richard used this studio to record their solo albums, and they enjoyed the atmosphere of the location. In the beginning, things went smoothly, but as the sessions wore on, cracks began to form between Roger and the rest of the band. Roger was always a bit of a bully in the group, but now his ego was getting the better of him. It was becoming clear that Roger wanted to take control of the band and push out those who opposed him. Nick Mason escaped most of the drama since he finished all his drum parts early in the process. David Gilmour pushed back because he thought that while Roger was a strong lyricist, music was not his forte. He knew Roger needed him in order for the album to be successful. This left Richard an easy target for Roger's frustrations. To be fair, they never had a great relationship to begin with. Even in the early days, he was always Roger's punching bag. If anything, they more tolerated each other for the sake of the band. But the crack between them grew even larger when Richard asked to be producer on The Wall. By all accounts, Richard didn't do anything during the recording sessions. He would just sit in the studio all day and not really contribute to the process apart from a few mutterings here and there. It got so distracting that Bob asked him to not come to their sessions anymore. Instead, Richard would go into the studio in the evening when Bob and Roger weren't there, but even then, he really didn't record anything. It was like Roger set him up to fail. According to Bob, Richard wasn't the type who performed well on his own. He really needed positive reinforcement to be his best. He needed that back and forth feedback from Roger saying, yes, that's good, or don't do that, try something like this. Richard had trouble expressing his thoughts around someone like Roger, who could be very direct and short-tempered. Whether intentional or not, Roger didn't have time to baby him or coax out his feelings. In Roger's mind, they were on a deadline. Everyone else was working extremely hard on getting this record made, and here was Richard sitting on his butt, not pulling his weight, and he had the nerve to ask to be producer on his record. I can't say I really blame Roger. In Richard's defense, though, he was going through a painful divorce at this time and he was missing his children terribly. The other band members' kids were young enough to travel with them to France, but Richards had to stay in school miles away in England. In short, he wasn't contributing anything because he was depressed and didn't know it. The rest of the band saw this as him not caring, which wasn't true. Things came to a head when sometime in June of '79, Columbia Records offered to increase the band's percentage points if they could deliver the album by the 1979 holiday season. Roger and Bob did some calculations and concluded they could make the deadline, but only if they employed a second recording studio and cut their summer break short by 1 week. Everyone agreed on the terms except for Richard. He wasn't willing to sacrifice vacation time with his family. This set Roger off to no end. The majority of the keyboard parts still needed to be recorded, and this was holding up the record. In Roger's mind, he was left with no choice but to make an ultimatum. Richard either leaves the band, or he will release the album under his name, not Pink Floyd's. Even though David felt Roger was way out of line holding the album hostage, he couldn't help but agree that Richard wasn't contributing much to the record. It wasn't personal, it was just business. They couldn't afford to lose the album to Roger. They had to release it as Pink Floyd. Though it pained him, Richard left the band, but on the condition that he could finish his parts for the album and then play on the tour. Roger agreed, but the matter was kept from the public. By September, recording moved to Los Angeles, where most of the sound effects were captured as well as where the final mix took place. And just like that, in a little over a year, with roughly 4 to 6 months logged in the studio and nearly $700,000 spent, they finished the album. But when they played it for their record label, Columbia was disappointed. They were not expecting a double album rock opera. They even tried to cut their losses by telling Roger he would receive a reduced percentage. He fought back, and Columbia executive Dick Asher offered to flip a coin to settle the matter. Roger replied with, "Why should he gamble on something he rightfully owned?" CBS backed down. In order for The Wall to fit on 2 records, a few changes needed to be made. What Shall We Do Now was cut completely, In the Flesh was shortened, as well as The Thin Ice. These changes were made at the very last minute and after all the printing was done, which is why some copies list a missing song and an incorrect running order. Also, whether intentional or not, Nick Mason and Richard Wright's names are nowhere to be found on original pressings. This was corrected on later editions, however. The Wall was released on the 30th of November in the UK, and by the time the album came out in America, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 became a surprise #1 hit single. The record spawned 3 more radio singles: Comfortably Numb, Run Like Hell, and Hey You. The album wasn't initially a hit with the critics, but commercially it did incredibly well, with over 1 million copies sold in the first 2 months. It would go on to be Pink Floyd's second best-selling record just after The Dark Side of the Moon. Sadly, The Wall also represents the last time the 4 men ever recorded together. David Gilmour later said it was the last of him and Roger working well together. But nearly 25 years later, the 4 would reunite one last time for a 20-minute live gig at the 2005 Live 8 concert. It's unclear if Richard and Roger ever made amends, but seeing them standing together up on that stage makes me believe that in the end, they could at least set aside their differences for the greater good. Really, I'm just glad that after all they went through as a band, they could have that happy reunion before Richard's untimely death in 2008. Preparations for the tour actually began while they were still recording the album in November of 1978. Roger reached out to architect Mark Fisher, who previously worked with the band creating inflatables for their 1977 Animals tour. Mark worked closely with artist Gerald Scarfe, turning his wonderful drawings and concept art into 3-dimensional inflatable puppets. Mark also sketched out how a live show could look, especially how the wall could be built on stage. Originally, Roger wanted to have just a wall and the band performing behind it, out of view of the audience. Of course, David Gilmour nixed this idea because it was still the band's job to entertain, and that wasn't gonna go over well. The next idea Roger had was to hold the concert inside of a giant inflatable worm with smaller worms climbing over the wall. He then wanted to transport the deflated worm by helicopter to each new city as a form of advertising. Regardless of the fact that this venue could only hold about 3,000 people, it was ultimately turned down because getting all the proper permits in the various cities was deemed far too complicated and, quite frankly, nearly impossible. Instead, Roger decided to go with smaller theaters of 20,000 seats or less because he didn't want to recreate the environment of their 1977 tour that sparked the whole concept of the wall in the first place. He still wanted to have the band walled off from the audience at some point, so the new idea was to construct the wall brick by brick during the first half of the show. Actually pulling this off was a whole other matter, and so sometime over the summer of 1979, Jonathan Park came on board to help engineer the whole thing. Together with Mark Fisher, their first task was to make the wall easy to build, durable, and repeatable. They worked through several revisions before deciding to use reinforced fireproof cardboard boxes that could be put together by the stage crew using compact lifts. The bricks would be stacked around several collapsible columns that would not only stabilize the wall, but rise as the wall got higher. At the end of each column was an elbow and a plate that could be activated to knock down the bricks for the finale when the wall comes crumbling down from the top. Each brick weighed roughly 22 pounds and could be folded flat for transport. Now, I've read several conflicting accounts as to the size of the completed wall, but it roughly stood 33 feet tall and spanned 260 feet across. In total, they used around 450 bricks, and each one measured 5 feet by 2.5, and they were 1.5 feet deep. For 2 weeks, the tech crew practiced and refined the process of building the wall at the MGM studios in Culver City. At the same time, music rehearsals were taking place across town at Leeds Studios in Los Angeles. Then the entire production moved into the venue location for 3 more weeks of rehearsals. David Gilmour was the musical director for the entire production. He was in charge of all the music cues as well as making sure everything was in sync with the visuals. At one point, he had a 6-foot-long cue sheet on top of his amp, but after the first couple of shows, he had this all memorized. Roger had the double task of not only performing on stage, but also directing all the visuals and sound effects. All in all, it was quite a task for both men. And then there was the issue of the lighting. While their original designer did an adequate job, Roger wasn't happy with the work, so at the last minute, literally the day before opening night, they hired designer Mark Brickman, who previously worked on a Bruce Springsteen tour. Mark saw a full dress rehearsal, went home, and drafted up a bunch of lighting suggestions that were just the changes Roger was looking for. On February 7, 1980, the doors of the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena opened for their first show. As the audience came into the theater, they were greeted by the wall partially built on stage, framing the famous 30-foot circular projection screen used on previous tours. Music from the 1940s played as a crowd found their seats, then a master of ceremonies entered the stage, played by a different radio DJ for each leg of the tour. He or she welcomed the audience and made some brief announcements. As the band walked on stage wearing black uniforms, they then began to play In the Flesh, interrupting the MC's monologue.
The band is about ready to go.
At the end of the song, a giant model airplane soars over the audience and crashes into the wall with sparks flying everywhere. It's at this point the band freezes, the stage lowers, revealing the real Pink Floyd behind them. To fool the audience, Pink Floyd had the decoy band wearing face masks resembling each member of Pink Floyd. This idea came from Roger's idea to have session musicians performing the shows behind the wall out of view of the audience. This way, these guys could go on tour, all while Roger could stay at home, play golf, and collect the money from the shows. But in the context of the show, they were supposed to represent what could happen to the band if they gave into the dark side of fame and channeled their power of influence into nefarious means. The members of the decoy band would continue to perform on stage with Pink Floyd, lending additional instrument parts, often rounding out the sound to closely match the feel of the record. The show then progressed in the order of the album and included the sound effects, children's choir, and string arrangements heard on the record. At specific moments during the show, one of the 3 30-foot tall inflatable puppets would grace the stage. These represented the mean school teacher, the overbearing mother, and the wife. Each one contained spotlights for eyes that pointed at the audience, creating a fantastic, leering feeling. Each of the puppets had fans underneath to blow air into their bodies to keep them inflated, but they could also use the fans to move the puppets by adjusting the speed of the fan. The show also featured an inflatable pig as a nod to their Animals tour. By the end of Act 1, the wall was complete and became a screen for more of Gerald Scarfe's animations. However, because of its width, they ended up using 3 projectors linked together. These were then patched into the same click track that the band were using to keep in sync with each other and the sound effects. And all of this was controlled by essentially 8-track tape machines. In fact, pretty much the entire show was done without computers, using almost all analog equipment with very few digital components. One of the most ingenious designs was incorporating a hotel room into the wall itself during the song Nobody Home. The look of the room was based on the actual Hotel Tropicana where many of the crew members were staying during tech rehearsals. Even the chair used on stage was taken from one of the hotel rooms. But probably the most amazing moment happens during Comfortably Numb. A single spotlight illuminates Roger as he sings in front of the completed wall. Then when the chorus comes in, another spotlight hits David Gilmour standing atop the wall, singing and playing that famous guitar solo. Man, I wish I could have been there. I mean, that solo is epic enough on its own, but seeing David wailing atop a 33-foot wall just sends the song over the moon. The grand finale culminates with Scarfe's The Trial animation that leads right into the wall, breaking apart and falling down. Several subwoofer speakers provided additional rumbling that made it seem as if the whole venue was collapsing. After this, all the musicians come onto the stage playing the final song outside the wall on acoustic instruments. From the audience perspective, the show was a massive success, but because it was so expensive to produce and they only played 31 shows in small venues, they just couldn't make their money back. It's estimated the band lost $600,000. In fact, the only member of Pink Floyd to make money was Richard Wright because he was hired as a session player for the tour. Despite being paid, he probably had it the worst because he still had to see Roger every night of the tour. He coped by convincing himself that if he played well enough, Roger would realize his error and ask him to come back. Sadly, this never happened, but he was invited to rejoin the group years later once Roger left the band and David took over. In the end, despite losing money, the show was a success. It blurred the line between a Broadway musical and a rock concert. It pioneered the album concert idea that's become so popular with today's nostalgia-driven tours. Whereas those shows are trying to deliver an idealized version of the band from their heyday, the Wall Tour was Pink Floyd at the peak of the Roger Waters-led era. Roger would go on to recapture some of that magic in 1990 with a one-night-only show in Berlin to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall. It would be another 20 years before Roger would bring the wall back for a proper world tour in 2010. After playing 200 shows spread over the course of 3 years, it became the highest-grossing tour for a solo musician. After the release of his 1980 film Fame, director Alan Parker was gearing up to shoot his next feature when, through a series of chance encounters, he found himself in a meeting with Roger Waters. During their conversation, Roger asked Alan to direct the movie version of The Wall. Being a longtime Floyd fan, Alan was flattered by the offer but couldn't commit to the project because it conflicted with his next film. But possibly the real reason he passed on directing was because Alan didn't see where he could fit in creatively. Roger and artist Gerald Scarfe already completed a lot of pre-production work, including a basic script and a highly detailed storyboard book. As a consolation, Alan offered to produce the film and suggested that his cinematographer Michael Sorensen work with Gerald to co-direct the movie. Alan's first task as a producer was to secure funding for the film. Armed with Gerald's fantastic storyboard pitch book, he first approached Pink Floyd's record label EMI, but they passed. He then went to Hollywood, and even with his clout as an Oscar-nominated director, he had a hard time convincing investors that the movie was more than just another concert film. People didn't understand it or didn't see its potential. He eventually got MGM to put up the money, even though the MGM executive told Alan that he had no idea what the film was about. In other words, they only gave him the money because Alan directed Fame, which was a huge success for MGM, and they were hoping for a second lightning strike. At this point, the film was going to contain actual concert footage from the Wall tour, incorporating not only the band but the inflatables as well as the animations. The idea was to film several nights of the tour and then shoot additional story elements outside of the concert venue. Several filming attempts were made during the Earl's court appearances in 1981, but all were deemed unsuccessful. Besides an elaborate crane shot that they never got right, the main problem was the lighting. What works for the eye doesn't really work for the camera, and so they needed to use a lot more light to expose the film. Unfortunately, these were still live performances with a paying audience, and Roger wasn't willing to sacrifice any aspect of the show for the sake of the film. Michael and Gerald even attempted to film the audience's reaction, but again, they needed to shine bright lights in their eyes, and well, you can just imagine how well that went over with folks who paid good money to watch Pink Floyd perform.
I've queued up for 4 hours to get this ticket, and someone has even stolen my sleeping bag.
So with the live show footage officially scrapped, Alan Parker's schedule freed up and he came back on board to direct the film. Formal pre-production began with a screen test of Roger playing the main character. It was soon discovered, however, that he wasn't the best actor in the world, so the search for a new lead began. Casting Pink was difficult because not only was Roger notoriously picky, but they also wanted an actor who could sing. It was then that Alan saw the music video for I Don't Like Mondays by the Boomtown Rats, and he was struck by the photogenic lead singer Bob Geldof. Alan met with Bob, offered him the role, but Bob turned down the project. He didn't care for the story, nor did he like Pink Floyd music, especially their lyrics.
And I'm not mad for the Floyd's music, like, hate their lyrics,
And you have to understand Bob's perspective. He came out of the punk generation, and they looked at bands like Pink Floyd as the antithesis to their movement, to their whole aesthetic. For him to work with the Floyd would be almost treasonous. Alan wasn't giving up though, and he pleaded with Bob's manager to make him reconsider. On a cab ride together, Bob refused the part again, telling his manager, "F those guys, I can't stand Pink Floyd." This eventually got back to Roger since his brother just so happened to be the cab driver. It's not clear what ultimately convinced him to change his mind, but it was almost the fact that he didn't want the part that made him so right. Now, Bob wasn't an actor per se, but I think what he brought to the table was real-world rock star experience. He also brought a certain naivete because he wasn't a seasoned actor, and so he just threw himself into the part. From shaving off his eyebrows to floating in a pool for hours just to get a shot even though he didn't know how to swim. The only time he ever complained was during the limo sequence when he had to wear an uncomfortable latex costume. With their new lead in place, it didn't make sense to incorporate Pink Floyd into the film, and so Alan pushed to not feature any footage of any band, but instead blend Gerald's animations with actors using minimal dialogue. He wanted it to be a musical movie and let the music of The Wall tell the story. So he, along with Gerald and Roger, worked together to come up with visuals to match the music. Roger typed out what they came up with, and Gerald drew up storyboards. By the time they were finished, Gerald's room was covered with hundreds of storyboard images. Despite good intentions, however, the three men butted heads, with Roger and Gerald on one side and Alan on the other. It really was a clash of egos, as they were all used to getting their own way in their own fields. Much of the contention stemmed from Alan needing a certain amount of control over the film, but since Gerald and Roger already spent essentially 3 years working on it, they weren't about to give up ownership. What Roger really didn't understand is that making a film is completely different than making a record. It's so much more expensive, as you can't just make it with a couple of guys in a studio. Even at the minimum, you have to have a crew, and you have to feed that crew, and you have to pay them. Each day you film, it gets more and more expensive. Even with their modest budget of $12 million, they still needed a large crew to build sets, create costumes, run the lights, etc. It literally takes a village to make a film, and because of that, compromises have to be made. You only have so much time in a day to get the shots you need, and sometimes you don't get the shot. It's a fact that all filmmakers understand to their core. It's a constant fight to capture your vision on film. Unfortunately, Roger, and I think to a lesser extent Gerald, didn't understand this and they constantly fought with Alan when it came to the changes he wanted to make in order for the story to work best on film. It got so heated between the men that Alan took up chain smoking as a coping mechanism, while Gerald got in the habit of taking a swig of whiskey in the morning before each meeting. And Roger felt that Alan was betraying him and took to wearing a sports coat with a knife in the back to show how he felt. In the end, it was decided that Roger should take a vacation rather than be on set for the 60+ days of principal photography. Gerald, for his part, buried himself in the animations away from the set. While they reused the animations from the tour, they couldn't just be inserted into the film as they were in the wrong format. The hammer sequence, for instance, needed additional hammers drawn on to fit the now wider film. The flower sequence had to be extended to better flow with the live-action narrative, which was no small feat, however. Each frame took a day to make, and because you need 12 frames for every second of film, it could take up to 2 weeks to make 1 second of animation. Thankfully, Gerald had a team of nearly 50 artists working together, but even then, some of them needed to pull incredibly long hours to get everything done on time, sometimes working 36 hours straight. While Gerald was busy drawing, Alan commenced with the live-action filming. The bulk of the interiors were shot at the famous Pinewood Studios, with additional exteriors shot in and around London. The battlefield sequences were shot in Devon, the very same beach location that was used for the cover of A Momentary Lapse of Reason a few years later. Most of the shoot went smoothly, with the only exception being the fascist rally sequence. They had anywhere between 200 and 300 extras on set. Now, this wasn't a problem in itself, save for the fact that the sequence had some violent moments, and sometimes the extras didn't stop when Ellen yelled, "Cut." Concentrate! By and large, though, things went about as smoothly as they could have with that many extras. Alan did his best to capture the mood and feeling of Gerald's fantastic storyboards, with some of the most successful translations being the opening tracking shot, the pool scene, the bathroom scene, Pink outside watching TV, and the education sequence. Even Gerald was blown away that they were spending £100,000 on an elaborate set based on one of his drawings. In the end, that became one of the most iconic live-action moments of the film. It's interesting to note that Alan tried to use the teacher puppet during this sequence, but ultimately cut it out of the film because it was deemed too theatrical and it didn't look right on camera. I think the best blending of live action and Gerald's art was for the song Don't Leave Me Now. Pink is alone in his hotel room when the shadow of Pink's wife transforms into a mantis monster, evoking the look of the puppet used in the live show. This moment is so surreal and brilliant at capturing the feeling of the song, but I gotta say my favorite moment is the establishing shot of Pink. It was filmed on a sophisticated miniature rig using a specialized macro lens, and the final shot is just spectacular. The cigarette burnt all the way down was inspired by Roger finding Syd Barrett nearly passed out in a chair of a Hollywood hotel, gazing at nothing just like Bob's empty stare. Unfortunately, 2 songs did not make it into the film. The Show Must Go On was left out for unknown reasons, but an early cut of the film did feature Hey You. The sequence was cut out at the last minute for the sake of pacing. Roger felt that the imagery was too repetitive without contributing much. The editor ended up using many of the shots in the song Another Brick in the Wall Part 3. If you're curious, the Hey You sequence is available to view as a special feature on the DVD. Engineer James Guthrie came back to supervise the sound mix for the film. He, along with David and Roger, went back to the original master tapes to make minor tweaks to most of the music in the film. They remixed almost all of the tracks, and many of the songs were adjusted to fit the edit of the film by making them longer or shorter. A select few of the tracks had sections that were re-recorded just for the movie, and it was during this process that they were able to resurrect the song What Shall We Do Now, which was cut from the album right before its release to make it fit on 2 records. Composer Michael Kamen came back to expand on the string arrangements he wrote for the album, giving them a more cinematic feel as well as creating new orchestral pieces. Because so much of the film's music was virtually the same as the album, they decided against releasing a soundtrack. Instead, they put out the single When the Tigers Broke Free, which was originally written for The Wall, but was left off because the other band members felt it was too personal to Roger. But that specificity worked for the film. It drew the audience to the character of Pink and helped them to identify with him. The song itself memorializes Roger's father, who died during World War II at the Battle of Anzio. For the most part, David Gilmour didn't have much to do with the film. For him, the album and the tour were far more important than the movie. However, because it was still a Pink Floyd project, meant that his name was going to be on it. Therefore, he had a vested interest in it succeeding. And there was a point when Alan was about to walk away from the project because Roger didn't want to give him the final cut of the film. David had to step in and assure Alan that he would get the final say. The way David saw it was that they were playing with Hollywood money and they needed a Hollywood director to make the film correctly. They had too much on the line to just let Roger have his say. They had to trust Alan to finish the film. On top of that, drummer Nick Mason was on David's side and they could easily outvote Roger's input on the matter. This move became one of the major breakdowns between Roger and David that ultimately led to Roger leaving the group in 1985. The film premiered in May of '82 at the Cannes Film Festival, but it was not part of the competition. It was screened at the original Palace Theatre, and they actually brought in their own sound system because the existing speakers were terrible. But because the new speakers were so much louder, the vibrations rattled the plaster walls and ceiling, sending a ton of dust into the air, adding a surreal atmosphere to an already unusual film. Apparently, Steven Spielberg was in attendance and afterwards was seen asking, "What the F was that all about?" Overall, critical response was quite positive and the film did well at the box office, grossing $22 million. The film won 2 BAFTA awards for Best Original Song and Best Sound. Looking back on the film, Roger regrets not adding more humor to the story. In his personal life, he loves to laugh and he wishes that was better reflected in the film.
It's a pretty dour 2 hours.
Because Gerald did not enjoy making the film, he avoided watching it for a long time after the premieres. These days, he believes the film is just okay, with some parts being great while others he would love to do again. He is most proud of his Goodbye Blue Sky animation. Director Alan Parker is satisfied with the film, but ultimately never felt like it was his. Throughout filming, he had the impossible job of balancing making a great movie while staying true to the creative work of Gerald and Roger. He never felt comfortable making certain changes to the story in service of a better film because it would upset Gerald and Roger. In the end, it was a very miserable experience for him as he likened it to going over Victoria Falls in a barrel. He went on to direct 2 more music-driven movies, The Commitments and Evita. After nearly 5 years in the making, the 3-part project came to a close. Unbelievably, at each stage, from the album to the tour and finally the film, they were incredibly successful. Yes, they lost money on the tour, but the shows themselves were fantastic and the film itself earned back its budget and then some. And to think, all this creativity was sparked from Roger spitting on a fan. In the years since the film's release, it has continued to entertain, inspire, and challenge viewers. Well, that is the story of how Pink Floyd built the wall, toured the wall, and finally captured the wall for all to see. Well, that is all the time I have for you. I want to thank you so much for watching. I am your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Hey everybody, thanks again for watching part 3 of my making of the wall. If you haven't already, be sure to watch parts 1 and 2, or check out more great Pink Floyd content here on the channel. If you like what you see, I put out new videos every Tuesday and sometimes Fridays.